Is eating animals morally wrong according to utilitarianism? Do keep in mind, though, that this is only my interpretation of a bunch of texts that I haven't read all the way through, so take everything I say with like a mountain of salt. What is utilitarianism? Simply put, utilitarianism is a moral framework that posits that the correct thing to do is the action that maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering for the most amount of people. So, in the famous thought experiment, the trolley problem, the correct thing to do is the one that saves the most amount of people. In this case, would be by pulling the lever. Utilitarianism is very practical in the day to day, as it's just math, so it's very easy to figure out what the correct thing to do is. The original founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, meant that any being with a capacity for suffering has moral worth. This means that to Bentham, animal suffering mattered just as much as human suffering. He also meant that quantity of pleasure mattered more than quality. John Stuart Mill, as a student of Bentham, disagreed with this. Mill meant that some forms of pleasure were higher than other forms. He famously said, "It's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." With this, he meant that, for example, the pleasure of reading a book is higher than the pleasure of scrolling reels, as the pleasure of learning is worth more than just a temporary relief from suffering. He therefore meant that humans, due to their increased capacity for pleasure and suffering, matter more than animals. Peter Singer actually disagreed with this and called Mill's attitude speciesism, which is basically like sexism or racism, but for species. He says that treating one species differently requires a morally relevant difference. Intelligence is one very common argument we give for being allowed to use animals however we want. But this argument quickly falls apart if you consider that some pigs are actually smarter than a lot of babies. Singer believes, like Bentham, that the ability to talk or reason is irrelevant, and that what morally matters for a being is their capacity for suffering. However, he also believes, like Mill, that there are higher and lower forms of pleasure and suffering. So animals might have a lower capacity for suffering, and therefore might not matter as much as humans, but they do have to be taken into account in the calculations. Now, this actually leads into one of the biggest problems in utilitarianism, which is how complicated calculations can be due to the unforeseen consequences that could spring from any action. If we take, for example, a random person going into the grocery store, buying a pack of ground beef, and then cooking up a nice, tasty burger, and then enjoying that burger, there would be no suffering in that action, right? As the animal is already dead, so it can suffer. And in fact, he actually gained pleasure from this. So is this a morally good action? The problem here is that when the person buys the ground beef, the farmers see that there is a demand for it, and therefore will have to increase the supply. So even though there was no suffering involved for the person in the exact moment, the financial incentives for the farmers were slightly impacted, which means that they're now going to have to harm more animals. But is farming even bad? Normal farming in itself isn't bad. The problem is factory farming. Factory farming brings extreme amounts of suffering for a minuscule amount of pleasure. Meat tastes good, yes, and we like not spending too much money for it. But putting pigs, cows, and other animals in small cubicles for their whole lives, never even letting them see real grass, is just absolutely abhorrent. We fatten them up as much as we possibly can just to slaughter them in gas chambers for it to be as cost effective as possible. Even John Stuart Mill, who values humans way higher than animals, would think of this as completely morally wrong. But just because factory farming is one of the worst things in the world doesn't make normal farming wrong, as if you treat the animals humanely and give them good lives, then the overall pleasure in the world would increase and therefore would be morally good. So utilitarianism is not the same as vegetarianism, because for utilitarians, the problem isn't eating the meat in itself. The problem is bringing into the world unnecessary suffering by inhumanely treating animals. I therefore think that according to utilitarianism, eating animals isn't wrong. What is wrong is factory farming. But what do you think? Do you think we're morally permitted to eat animals? Let me know in the comments.